About Time is a national newspaper designed to be read by the prison population of Australia. That's about 40,000 people. It's going to include news and investigations, often topical stories focused on the prison and criminal justice systems themselves, first-person experiences, letters, coverage of health, culture, the legal sector, and First Nations communities. Now, the publication is one edition in, and that first edition has covered everything from a feature on the benefits of dogs in prison and new research and strategies into the lasting effects of childhood abuse, all the way through to creative writing exercises, poetry, and yoga lessons. This morning, we're going to be joined on the podcast by a managing director of About Time, Joe Friedman. As you listen to it, just remember that I will throw a link to About Time and that first edition in today's show notes. Joe, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Sam. It's good to be here. I'm actually dialing in from Lake Bled in Slovenia, of all places.
Wow. So thanks for taking a bit of time on what I assume is a holiday to chat to TDA this morning. We really appreciate it. I'm really excited to get stuck into this and your new project. When I was looking at About Time, this project that we're going to talk about, it took me back to when I was probably 8 or 9 years old and the first song that I ever cried at, which was Paul Kelly's How to Make Gravy. And for those who don't know the song, it's basically this letter from an inmate, and there's been disputes about whether it's fictional or real, but in any case, it brought a lot of emotion to me. Have you experienced similar emotion when reading the journalism that's produced by prisoners for your publication?
Yeah, we have. We definitely have. The letters we've received so far from people who are currently in prison and people who were formerly incarcerated are quite meaningful, quite profound. They're stories about a life of trauma and difficult upbringings that in many ways have led to or contributed to these people committing their crimes. You know, they don't exist in a vacuum. And it's quite, I guess, uplifting to read about where they were and where they are today, and the message they're sending to people who are currently in prison and people who might be thinking about committing crimes, about perhaps a better way to do things.
Would you describe About Time as a newspaper, or is it more of a lifestyle magazine? Like what kind of shelf in the newsagent would you put it on?
We want it to be in the newspaper shelf. It's not a magazine, it's not a newsletter. We want it to feel like a newspaper. It's something that people in prison receive with regularity, that they feel like it's information, it's news, it's art, it's poetry, it's letters, it's stories, all the kind of general things that go into a newspaper. The difference is that it's specifically for them, about them, and often by them.
Did this project come about because you noticed a gap and you thought that there should be something there, or was this something that was requested by inmates?
It was the former. I heard about a similar paper called Inside Time in the United Kingdom, which has been around since 1990, and it started off as a quarterly 12-page black and white attempt to give people in prison a voice. And now, 34 years later, it's a monthly colour 60-plus page edition that goes out to over 50,000 people across prisons and detention facilities in the UK, and it's loved and it's cherished. We heard about Inside Time, learnt that nothing of the sort existed in Australia, learnt that people in prison in Australia would love something of the sort, and went about putting it all together.
How did you establish that they actually wanted it? Like, what was that process like? Was that research or anecdotal evidence?
It was a bit of both. So I initially kind of assembled a team of different individuals from criminal justice organisations and prisoners' legal services around Australia, and those people had contacts and clients inside prison, and so I guess that's the anecdotal piece. But then we also ran focus groups of people who were formerly incarcerated and asked them all about it. The response was pretty universal. It was, yeah, this sounds great. We're not sure you'll actually be able to get this in, but if you can, we know that people would love it. We wish we had something like this when we were in prison.
So you sit down with these focus groups of ex-people who have been in prison. There's clearly a need. There's overseas examples, but you just highlighted there what I suspect was a little bit of a roadblock, which was actually the viability of distributing a publication amongst the prison systems, which are state and territory based, not federal based.
Yes.
How have you found the journey of actually trying to get this publication behind bars?
Yeah, and that was probably what we were most worried about. We knew that we could, even if we raised enough money, even if we found a lot of people to write, contributors, even if the interest was there, ultimately, Australia is a federation. There are 8 states and territories. Each jurisdiction has its own corrections authority, corrections department, and they get to decide what goes in and out of prison. And often they can be quite strict, sometimes even more strict than in America or the UK. And so we knew that if we didn't get approval from corrections, the paper wasn't going to happen. But we decided, let's just ask. And so we just email the commissioners and we say, hey, this is what we want to do. This is why we want to do it. What do you think? And I think that's a really good lesson just to ask, because you never know what response you're going to get. And in Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania, and the ACT, the response was, okay, sure, great. This sounds like it will be good for our population, and so it will be good for us. We haven't been quite as successful in the other jurisdictions. We haven't received hard no's. We just haven't got full authority and approval yet. But since the positive response to the first edition has kind of come through, that they do seem to be coming on board.
Joe, I've got 2 more questions for you before I let you get back to a Slovenian holiday. The first question is, I want you to make this really real for us listening here. Can you tell me about a piece that made it into the first edition, perhaps a little bit about the author of that piece, and give us a sense of kind of how this all comes together and what it means?
If I can indulge, I might give two quick ones.
Please.
One from someone with direct experience of incarceration. His name is James, and he writes about how he's spent most of the past 4 years in prison. And the reason he's spent that much time in prison is because of alcohol. When he was young, he had terrible issues with anxiety, and he was able to kind of push that aside by drinking. And he would drink with all of his friends, but he would be the only one who drove home after drinking because it just felt easier to him. He didn't have anyone advising him against that. And it resulted in him being constantly intoxicated, fighting with police, resisting arrest, just a whole lot of terrible events that resulted in him spending most of his time in prison. And I think what's quite meaningful and empowering about James's story is that something changed and something clicked. And he writes in our first edition, in our letters section, about how he's managed to turn his life around and how he's focused on his eating and his exercise and his health and his mindfulness and mental health as well. I think there's a lot of people who could relate to James and his position, but his words of kind of encouragement feel like they could do a whole lot of good to other people going through something similar.
Wow.
The other piece that's quite powerful is from a former police officer. This person was a Victorian police officer for 2 years, hasn't had any experience with incarceration, but we encourage contributions from anyone with, contact or interaction with the criminal justice system.
Right, so it's not just people inside prison.
That's right. I mean, if anyone has something they think that's valuable to write, we'd love them to contribute. And this person, who's anonymous for the story, writes about how they felt compelled to quit and leave the police force and move into the private sector because of a racist and toxic culture inside Victoria Police. And I can't recall reading a story from an ex-officer being so open about issues within the force. And I think it's something that everyone should read. Yeah.
They're 2 very powerful examples. I was actually lying about the fact that I had 2 more questions. Now I've got 2 more questions because I'm just really enjoying where this is going. But this should be a quick one. Was there any part of the planning from the founders of this? Was there any sort of thinking about how this could actually be used as a mitigating factor when prisoners are appealing for parole or for early release? Like, did that come into the thinking of this?
It didn't come into the thinking, but I think what's good about this is it's a new initiative and we're receiving advice and thoughts all the time. And so what you've just said is definitely a great idea. And if the paper If the paper goes off, if it succeeds, if we get so much response, if we can kind of cultivate new writers and creators from it, I'm sure that would be a wonderful tool to show to the parole board. Look at the rehabilitation that we've managed, and this is what we're going to go and do after we leave prison. So, I mean, we would definitely strive for that.
I can't claim it as my idea. When I was doing some research for our chat, I was reading about this in New York, in the state of New York, where it can be seen as good behavior when somebody contributes to the prison newspaper, and it's used by a parole board to kind of ascertain where they are both mentally and how committed they are to work and all of that, those kind of factors. So a very interesting angle. I'd love to kind of follow that up almost in a couple of years and see where it's at. Final question from me. I found that one of the most interesting ideas when looking at About Time was that you have granted people in prison, not exclusively people in prison writing, but for those who are in prison writing, you've granted them the freedom of the press. And there's some irony in the fact that they're granted the freedom of the press, but they're not free themselves. What are your thoughts around how your project can enhance somebody's sense of freedom?
It's interesting because Australia, we don't have this kind of innate right to freedom of the press like they do in America, which is why corrections departments have the ability not to distribute. There's nothing requiring them to do so, and we're grateful to them for doing so. I think that there's maybe perhaps physical and metaphorical sense of being locked up. But being physically locked up and away from society doesn't mean you have to be metaphorically locked up. There's no reason why you can't have connection to the outside world through other means. That's the kind of core principle of this paper, that we want to, open a window into the world of incarceration. We want to allow these people to know what's going on outside, even if they can't walk and live outside. And with that, we think that they'll feel less imprisoned, less restricted. And if they do, then we know we've succeeded.
Joe Friedman, I feel like How to Make Gravy by Paul Kelly has such a special part in Australian culture. It's got this real kind of sacred spot, and I have a feeling that About Time is destined for a similar place in the way that we think and feel about our justice system. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Sam. I hope we can get there.
That's all we have time for on today's edition of the Daily Aus. I've put a link in the show notes to read the first edition of About Time, and that you can also support their journalism. That's all from us today. We'll speak to you again tomorrow.